Okay, it says that we're live, so I'm just going to assume that it's working. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us for our next session of the Anti-Racism online conference with the Hamilton Center for Civic Inclusion. My name is Sarah. I am a program coordinator at the Hamilton Center for Civic Inclusion. Usually Kojo hosts this, and I'm not as charismatic over video, so you're just going to have to adjust, but I'm happy that you're here watching with us, and I'm here with Yaara Gallo, who is an Indigenous medical student at McMaster, who's going to be talking to us today about Indigenous perspectives in the healthcare system. Before we start off, though, it's important to acknowledge that we are on the territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples, governed by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement, and Yaara Gallo is going to go into that into more detail in her talk today. Thank you so much for joining us. We also have two ASL interpreters here, and the opportunity for you guys all to ask questions as we move along through this talk that will be answered at the end of this talk. So I'm going to pass it off to Yaara Gallo.
Sego Sawagwego, Yaara Gallo Niongets, Ginekihaga Waxcolor Wage, Dehanagali Jeet Nilgi Delode, Oshwigan Wagenage Lado, McMaster Gadwiata, Ununquasunta Gadwiesta. Hi everyone, my name is Yaara Gallo Jonathan. I'm a Mohawk Bear Clan from Six Nations of the Grand River Territory, where I was born and raised. I'm involved in my community of Six Nations and have been involved in the Hamilton community for the past 10 years or so, having completed my bachelor's and master's at McMaster University in Sociology and Indigenous Studies. I'm currently a medical student at McMaster, and I'm an Indigenous mentor with the Indigenous Students Health Science Office. I hope to be a family doctor one day in my community. Outside of being a student for what seems like forever, I also engage in a lot of advocacy and education work, particularly around medical curriculum. I have done this in other roles and in the past, and in my current role as the National Officer of Indigenous Health for the Canadian Federation of Medical Students, and I'll be the incoming Director of Global Health. Outside of that work, I enjoy being a traditional doula and helping the women in my life with their birthing process. I also co-host a podcast called Heartberry Podcast, and I'm trying to finish my tiny house on wheels. Like Sarah said, the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement covers a lot of basically where Hamilton is, and it goes up to Niagara region. And what's significant about that is if you look at the Treaty of Niagara, it's the first treaty that was done with British representatives and Indigenous nations that signed this agreement in the 1700s, stating that anybody who comes to this country, what is currently Canada, is agreeing to follow Indigenous nations and their customs around taking care of the land, taking care of each other. So when we say that we are all treaty people, this is what we mean, is that you, by saying that you are a Canadian citizen, that this is your treaty, the Treaty of Niagara. And so if you didn't know that, I would recommend you look into that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my story. At the time of applying to medical school, I was questioned by people in my community if I really wanted to go to McMaster. I don't know if you recall what was happening a few years ago, back with the cases of 2 Indigenous children at McMaster. I have permission to speak with about one of the kiddos from my community. Her name is Deekwa. I'll speak a little bit about her a bit later. What folks don't realize is due to the conflation and misinformation spread by the media, there were 2 girls, and they were from separate communities, one from mine, one from another one. When these events happened, there was a fracturing of trust of the medical community within my community members. I know that there have been efforts to repair this, but experiencing racism and discrimination in the healthcare field is not new for our communities, and it will take a while to repair this collective trauma. Despite this, I chose McMaster when I accepted my offer at admissions. When I entered medical school, I was a very naive person. I had assumed that medicine would be better than my past experiences. Like, I can remember my very first experience with racism being in the 2nd grade. And I had such high expectations for everyone involved in the medical field, and those expectations were continuously shattered before I even began medical school. During the month that I was starting medicine, I was also finishing up my master's, and then I was also the program coordinator of the Indigenous undergraduate summer research scholars program at MAC. And I, like many other students, had applied for funding for school. I applied to OSAP, my band funding scholarship, and the medical student line of credit at the bank. All three I was denied. OSAP told me that they had issues with the fact that I would technically be in two programs at once, even if it was just for a week. My band scholarship denied my application because they had already given me funding for my undergraduate degree. And the federal government policies dictate that only one degree can be supported. And my old bank, RBC, denied my line of credit. This line of credit is the one that every single medical student gets, regardless of their personal income and or their parental support towards their education. My peers told me that they were approved in a matter of a few days. Meanwhile, I had applied months previously, and inquiring about it, like I was told that I was denied. So when I called RBC to question it, the worker on the phone told me that I was denied because I was Native, and don't I get school for free anyways. I later discovered that the RBC call center was in Winnipeg, which explains the racist notions around denying my application. So the first week of medical school, I was running around to these three offices, trying to get someone to help me borrow money so that I could actually do this degree. I approached other banks and was denied by them because RBC denying me. And it started to look like I would have to drop out of school within the very first week. Then came the interactions with medical students. The sheer amount of racism and ignorant comments were overwhelming. There wasn't a single month of my medical training, and there hasn't been, that I have not encountered racism. It started on the very first day, and it hasn't stopped. And because I'm a trained sociologist, all of this is documented. There wasn't a single space or place that was safe for me. In each of our classes, the different types of teaching staff at the school, doctors, nurses, patients, it was a lot to handle. And this on top of the steep learning curve of learning medicine, the amount of education and advocacy that I was thrown into, coupled with the numerous amount of deaths in my life, it was extremely challenging. And these places and their leave policies aren't made for someone like me who comes from quite a large family. I have 30 aunts and uncles, not including their spouses. Nor does it allow for appropriate time off to attend ceremony, despite this being an actual right within the Human Rights Office on campus. This all ended with me on a break for my first class. The cherry on top was I had to file 2 official complaints on racial violence that I faced, and had to revisit this trauma at every single meeting while planning curriculum for free because MAC was lacking in Indigenous health curriculum. And as a result, my grades started to suffer. Plus, given the structure of the program and the serious lack of supports or planning around racial incidences like the one I encountered, I was forced to take a full year off from my program. This was a great loss and a shift in my plans. Pretty much everyone in medicine is type A personality, and I'm still working on breaking this despite all the curveballs that are thrown in my path. However, it has also brought me to my current therapist, and I'm so grateful for her. I was able to see how hard I had tried to educate people and the toll that it took on me. I had assumed that they were just ignorant and would be able to care for Indigenous patients if they only knew. What I didn't expect was the continued willful ignorance and harm that these kinds of people perpetuate, and that they're allowed to continue their path in medicine without any repercussions. Even if you brought the concerns to the administration, which I had. So I spent the year healing, learning how to repair the wounds on my soul from these harms, traveling and in ceremony with my family and friends. I also legally changed my name to my Mohawk name because the school refused to state that my preferred name was Yaara Gallo when I received my white coat. After asking them and writing it down phonetically, and I was actually also told by another medical student that I was making this process difficult. In front of my family and friends, we were so excited because I told them that we're going to hear my Ongwehoe name, my traditional name, when I got my white coat, but they skipped over it. So this type of insult drove me to finalize the name-changing process that I had been debating months prior. When I eventually went back to medical school in my second class, I felt like a new person, like new name, new coping mechanisms. I had finished the in-class portion and started on the in-hospital rotations, which I loved so much. I think my strength really lies in patient interactions and ensuring that they feel heard and supported. But I had to face the struggles of my first year again, being forced to meet with a conference room full of white doctors who didn't acknowledge nor seem to understand the impact of this and what it had on me. Unfortunately, my meetings with this group haven't ended as I began to struggle with multiple choice exams as well. And instead of offering support to me, they asked me or forced me into another break and asked me to do a neurocognitive assessment. They perceived me to potentially having a learning disability, rather than to listen to me explain that it wasn't my intellect that was the issue, but the lack of support that I haven't been given with everything that I'm going through, and the inflexibility of the school. For students who have to take multiple mini leaves a year to attend funerals. And no, they didn't need to spend a couple of thousands of dollars to tell them exactly what I had been telling them for years, but they did so anyways. And this second pushing off the path eventually led me to a third break because of COVID and the school's inability to communicate effectively with me. And so now I'm in my fourth class. The school continues to deal these blows to my person. And I'm working on processing these emotions while being in reality with what the school has decided for me. I'm also a Cancer moon and sun, so I believe that there's a lot of emotions that I have to process. An example of this is that I'm currently in online classes, and I have been for the past few months. I live on the reserve, and we only have one internet provider in my area. The Wi-Fi is very poor, and I get kicked off of meetings almost daily and have to shut off my camera or shut down and restart every day. I know for some folks, school and work has forced them into this, and it wasn't really considerate of the online learning that they've had to do. So I complained to the school, and I was told by a white lady that I should call the internet provider to speak to the manager, as if this would solve my internet issues on reserve or within my household, and as if the solution would solve the issues that I face as an Indigenous person. And I have to laugh. Like, I feel like when you face these kinds of situations or these kinds of people, you have to laugh because it's too much if you don't. My experiences illustrate that not only is healthcare and medicine harmful to Indigenous folks and other Black, Indigenous, and people of color, but the training is harmful to us too. Quitting honestly would have been so much easier, and I know more than a handful of Native students who have done just that. And this is a serious loss for our communities. To have these bright minds pushed out of medicine rather than supported through it, it's truly tragic. It is especially hard for those of us that are from community and are easily identifiable. Being involved in leadership positions and knowing numerous Native students throughout the years has shown me this. I sometimes have had other Indigenous learners who don't identify to other people or who have white skin privilege tell me that their experience wasn't as hard and that I just need to fit into the mold of what they want us to be. And I actually know some folks who tell numerous Indigenous students this every year, that they have to leave their culture at the door. We have to fit into the mold. And so not only is this extremely harmful, but some of us can't do this. I can't not be Mohawk, and I can't be perceived as not othered when people look at me. And so to me, when I reflect on this, this is especially hard and harmful to students like me, who are first generation in both sides of my family to not attend residential school. And I'm currently grappling with the reality that my education in elementary school is currently part of a class action suit against the federal government for the harms that it caused. If you don't know about this, I would advise that you Google Indian Day School class action. So moving on to some experiences of racism within healthcare. I'll talk about two incidences that I have permission to share. As I stated before, what happened a few years ago with McMaster and my community was a collective trauma. Yes, it happened to Dayakwa and her family, but this family I was raised with, and they're very well known in our community, and our community really rallied behind them when it happened and since then. The harm that was caused by ignoring and not fully hearing the family's wishes, discrediting our medicines, and the physician who stated that anyone who believed in traditional medicine should be thrown in jail. The lack of acknowledgement for our people or anybody as a whole human being needing to be in balance. White doctors not liking what the family is doing or utilizing the child welfare agency or the court systems to force treatment. And the irony that the child welfare agency actually listened to the family and chose not to remove her because she wasn't at risk of being harmed, and they understood what the family wanted, but this didn't cause the doctors to back down, and they merely chose to bring it to a different agency, the court systems. So this was a continued traumatic event for my community, and it has had lasting impacts. It's proven to us that white healthcare providers don't really listen to us. They aren't here for us, and they will use any means necessary, especially when it comes to our children. And I think that's a particularly sore spot for us, given our history. And I don't think that this can be fixed with statements of apology or having a few conferences. I think that this needs to be a working collaboration to try and fix this. Luckily, Dayakwa, she's doing just fine. And she healed her spirit, and her family helped before she continued her treatment in Toronto. And as I just talked to her mom a few months ago, and she is doing great. She's a teenager. She's in remission. She's doing awesome. Another experience is a bit more recent, and that's of my own family. My sisters blessed me with two little gals that I get to be an auntie to. When she was pregnant with her youngest, it wasn't the easiest. She had what's called a partial placenta abruption, which is when the placenta tears away from the uterine wall. This causes discomfort, some spotting, and bleeding. My sister had these symptoms and was placed on bed rest. We took her in when it got to be too much, and we think that because she was taken in to Brantford Hospital quite a few times, she was labeled as what we call in medical terminology a frequent flyer. And because of other reasons, eventually her care was transferred to McMaster, and that's where she had her cesarean. And we were all visiting and holding baby, and I noticed her chart. It had a label on it, and it said name alert. And typically this is when there might be a patient that has a similar name, but I didn't know that at the time. And so being curious, I asked the doctor why this was on the chart. And he stated that he didn't know that because there wasn't any similarly named patients on the floor. but assumed it was due to other factors. This prompted me to ask my friends who are physicians what other factors there would be, and they stated that being young, being a single parent, and being a Native woman probably what prompted that to be placed on her chart. They then told me that this is often done by healthcare providers that are concerned about the baby and want to report to child welfare. I told my family of this, and we're all very angry, obviously. The fact that she was being judged on these factors and nothing else was ridiculous. And I began to run through what I thought would have been the trigger of this. Maybe any potential labels that were placed on her from her previous care to this one, because in medicine labels stick. The labels that we refer to patients, they stick in their charts for years to come, unfortunately. And so this could have happened. We don't know. What we do know is that my sister, a trained social worker, was never informed of any concerns and was being judged despite whatever circumstances involved in her care. She was simply being judged by someone in her circle of care. So when my sister and niece were recovered and ready to leave the hospital, the nurses told my sister that she could leave around noon. So my mom showed up with my other niece about an hour early to pack up the room and get ready for the ride home. I had already flown back to Winnipeg at this point to continue one of my electives. I had the privilege of working with an Indigenous physician, and she allowed me to go home for this special occasion. So my family waited for about 3 hours, and my mom kept going up to the nurse's station and asking what was wrong and what was going on, and they kept telling her that they weren't allowed to leave. My mom, after about hour 4, was fed up and asked what would happen if they left. In the medical world, we call it AMA, against medical advice, is when you leave. But my mom just knew it as people leave the hospital all the time. Why can't we? So the nurses told my mom that they would be forced to call Children's Aid if they left the hospital. My mom, being a social worker for the past 30 years, asked why, and they wouldn't give her any answers. So my mom told them that they could just call because she would probably know the worker and the band rep as well. Justifiably, she got angrier and said loudly is it because my sister is young? Is it because she is Native? And is it because she's a single mother? And no one responded to her, so she just went back to my sister's room. And not even 2 minutes later, a doctor came and discharged them home. So stories like this happen all the time. And as I spend more time in medicine, I have the privilege of folks sharing their stories with me. It's one of the greatest joys in medicine to come across Black, Indigenous, or people of color who automatically feel more comfortable in my presence and who tell me things that they wouldn't share otherwise or haven't shared otherwise. And I've been told it's because they know that I'll believe them and I'll listen. And I hold on to that so dearly. And unfortunately, there's no place for them to report harm. And there's no proper reporting mechanism for students if we want to report harm that we've witnessed, if it's perpetuated by staff, especially. And what if patients can't advocate for themselves? How can we hold these so-called professionals accountable for their racism, especially when they refuse to acknowledge it or if it's normalized? And the burden is often on the recipient of the racism or the witness to do the educating. And this is just plain exhausting. We didn't create these systems, and we don't fight tooth and nail to uphold them, yet we are continually tasked to try and dismantle them, and it's exhausting. With this newfound interest in the work, particularly with a lot of white folks, I would say to be prepared for a marathon, not a sprint, because it's going to take a long time to undo the harms that have been caused. And yeah, Nyawa, thank you. As we move into the question and answer period, I want to acknowledge that my experience and the trauma and emotions that I with the experiences might not enable me to answer questions. And so if I don't want to answer a question, or if my body's giving me a sign that it's not a good space for me right now, I'll just simply say pass or next question. But yeah, I'll go off.
Thank you so much for sharing your experiences with us today. As you were talking, I kept thinking about the parallels in terms of everything that's been covered in the media in the last few months, like I would say the last 6 months, around issues that Black women face when entering a hospital, or Black people face just dealing with pregnancy and other issues. And more recently, an article was written by Lyndon George talking about his experiences around anti-Black racism in a hospital here in Hamilton. And so that got me thinking, what are some parallels that you see between like issues that impact the Indigenous community and Black communities here in Canada, and how can we work more intersectionally and collaboratively to address these issues?
I see these issues happening in both communities a lot. And I think throughout the years, I've worked on trying to see it, because I feel like a lot of the times it can come, there's no better phrase that I have for this, but it's pression Olympics. It's like, we have this worse, we have this worse. And for me, a lot of the work that I've been trying to do to educate myself and unlearn a lot of things is to try and figure out how we can work together and not fight each other while trying to fight for this small piece of the pie. I'm a sociologist, so a lot of the theorists that we read is like, if you look at Marx's original writings and you look at, and not the interpretations of his writings, but if you look at his writings and you look at how we're all fighting for these scarce resources, and it's like this perfect system. It's a horrible system, capitalism, but it's a perfect system to have us fight each other and not look at the bigger picture, or trying to fight the oppressor. What we're trying, like, the oppressed is fighting each other to try and get attention. And so I'm very conscious of that when I've been in situations, and trying to unlearn that and not say, yeah, but we have it worse. And I think particularly in the recent months with COVID-19, with the movement with police brutality, I see this a lot in Native communities because we feel often unheard. A lot of our issues, we've been encountering them for a long time. We have murdered and missing Indigenous women, police brutality. Everything is quite similar in our communities. And so I think it's hard for a lot of people, particularly in Indigenous communities, to step away from the narrative of but we have it worse, and to work towards, okay, but how can we both have it pretty bad. Let's not compare our experiences, but let's work together to try and figure out how we can make it better for all of us. And for me, I actually had a conversation with somebody about this within the last few weeks, because I try a lot to educate not only myself but the people in my circle, by posting resources for them to educate themselves as well. But it was around the narrative of like, because with the movement to get rid of statues, the movement to get rid of name places, the movement to get rid of Mount Rushmore, a lot of people were posting that it's because of this movement by Black folks in the States that we're able to see these changes. And somebody was quite upset that this was something that I had posted, because they didn't want us to like thank be thankful when we've been fighting this for a while. And they said, it's hard. I understand it's very hard because we have a lot of similar lived experiences and similar oppressed histories. However, or trauma histories that we, if we can fight together with a similar goal, not to be thankful, but to try and work towards that as well. So not only are Black folks in the States lending their voice to trying to get rid of like Washington football team name or the Mount Rushmore. I don't even want to call it a monument because it's just very, like, it's a violation of sacred site. But how can we walk in this with gratitude that you guys are lending like your voice to us so that our issues are also broadcasted, and then we can also do the same when there are people or events or things that are happening in our communities. Why can't we pair up and work together to try and dismantle this? And I think I come with it from this mentality that we all have to work together because we're all oppressed in different ways. And so even if you become free one day, I'm hoping that your freedom will allow my freedom. And to me, I only see it in that way. I only see it as being a relationship that we have to work together to try and actually have equality.
Thank you for that answer. I also want to shout out March for Black Lives Hamilton, because they're doing a really good job of like centering the voices of Indigenous people here locally who are doing the work on the ground to fight against police brutality too, in a way that I haven't really seen mirrored in Toronto or some other cities. So yeah, I think I really resonate with your answer. We do have some questions coming in from Facebook. Peggy Russell asked, do you think this needs to become a part of their accreditation? I don't know how to pronounce that word. If racism can be proven, then their license is at risk, question mark. So I think that's asking, like,
Yes.
is there a way to have it so that if racism can be proven, it affects your ability to practice?
I think I'm frozen. Am I frozen?
I don't think you're frozen.
No? Okay. On my screen is frozen. So there are some great Indigenous physicians who are working towards accreditation standards to try and change it so that you have to learn how to care for other people in a safe manner in order to be a physician in Canada. I always frame it when I give lectures or talks as a patient safety issue. If we don't have physicians who are adequately prepared to perform, say, a physical exam on somebody who has a bigger body or somebody who has a different body, or able to look at a patient's skin and actually know what's going on despite whatever skin tone they have. If they're not able to do that, it's a patient safety issue. And I think my background in sociology allows me to know that we all have implicit bias, and it's working on these biases every single time they arise within you to counter that narrative so that eventually you won't have that bias in your mind. But physicians aren't trained to do this. A lot of the time, physicians are trained in very stereotypical ways to look at a patient and make judgment calls on them or snap decisions. And sometimes this helps because if they need urgent care, if you are able to look at them and kind of guess what's going on, then maybe you know the treatment that they need right now. But this also causes deaths. I mean, it worked against Brian Sinclair, and he sat in the ER for 34 hours. People looking at him and assuming that he was just a person who was houseless or a drunken Indian, rather than providing him with simple care. Changing a catheter is very simple, and he died. And so how many more deaths or how many more harms that are caused to Black, Indigenous, people of color, disabled folks, queer folks, all these different communities that we make a snap judgment on, and then all of a sudden it shifts their life, it damages their life, it could take their life. And to me, it is extremely important that medical schools start realizing that they need to treat, they need to train their students to treat all kinds of bodies. An example of this is when I was in my first class, I worked with some students who we tried to have we changed the clinical skills manual so that it included different skin tones, so that it included how to actually examine patients who had breast tissue. Because when we learned a cardiac exam and how to listen to somebody's heart or lungs, we would learn on typically white male bodies. And so when you're approached and you're not trained properly how to do this, how do you go into an encounter with somebody who has a different skin tone or has breast tissue or has a bigger body, and you don't know how to handle that? Like, we shouldn't be graduating people if they don't know how to handle that. And so to me, it's crucial that medical schools change the accreditation, or that the society changes the accreditation so that you cannot graduate from medical school if you do not know how to do this. And it needs to be more of a competency-based curriculum and not a grades-based curriculum.
Thank you for that answer. The next question comes from Margaret Walding. So she says, as a healthcare professional, should I ask a Black, Indigenous, or person of color patient to point out a harmful comment or a racist recommendation?
I think this puts a lot of onus on the person who might have been harmed. So I think of incidences when I've been harmed and somebody asks me for a solution to that harm. And I don't know if in that moment that they might be able to articulate it. I don't know how their body is reacting to that. I know for my own self, I've been in encounters where I've had something happen to me or near me, and my body goes through an acute stress response to that. And so that means that your heart rate rises. You can't control all of this, right? And so if somebody's in that fight, flight, or flee mode, or I probably said that wrong. If somebody's in that mode of, I don't know what to do, I feel like I'm being attacked, they might not be able to articulate to you the harm that was caused. And so I think as healthcare providers, one thing that I like doing is just learning from different people how to say things appropriately, and it's unfortunate because we're not properly trained. So you have to approach your colleagues. And so I've had this happen numerous times. People being like, oh, like, I've had this Indigenous patient. How do I say this? Or how do I do this? Or like, I remember being doing OB shadowing. I wasn't a clerk yet. And I was just shadowing this physician, and there was a patient who was walking the floor. And the nurses were making a lot of comments about her walking the floor. And I had to explain to them that she's Native, and that for us, walking didn't mean that we were going to flee, didn't mean that we wanted to go for a smoke, didn't mean anything that they were saying. For us, in our labor, we're told to walk. We're told that you have to be moving to get the labor moving along. And so a lot of it comes with the burden that's placed on Black, Indigenous, and people of color to do educating of their peers. And so if you don't have somebody in your life that can do that or is willing to do that for you, because you need to also make sure that they are willing to educate you in that way, then I think our medical field really has to look at trying to like have courses or workshops that train this, or have something that can talk about it. And a major thing that I think about more recently is I read somewhere online that diversity consultants get paid $400 to $600 an hour for the work that they do. And the work that I've done at McMaster over the past 4 years, I haven't gotten paid anything. I actually have had to pay them. So to me, if you're asking somebody to educate you, it's only right that maybe not giving them $400, but paying for dinner or buying them a book or whatever, to show gratitude that they're actually educating you and not doing it for free.
Thank you for answering that question. I think too, healthcare professionals inherently view everybody who enters a hospital or enters their line of work through ableist lenses. So even if it's like an Indigenous person, a Black person, or a white person, you're trained medically to have an ableist perspective that says something is wrong with this person that needs to be fixed. So there's absolutely no way you can expect patients or people walking in to point out harmful comments to you when you're walking around with that lens, because most people are already going to feel as though they don't have the same power that you do in that situation.
That's a great point.
Sorry to like jump in there.
No. And I really appreciate that, because I read somewhere else online that if you grow up, say me growing up, being quote unquote abled, I'm automatically growing up in a society where I don't think about the I don't even know the proper way to term this, but like folks who are not as able-bodied as me. I have to learn to unpack that. And so that is where, when we talk about if you grow up and you are cisgender, then you have to challenge the homophobia or the anti-trans lens that you were raised in. And so for me, that it adds a really great point that even for me, I have a lot of work to do to make sure that I'm not operating under any of those lenses as well.
Yeah, and it's hard to do in a hospital setting anyway, because it's built to treat anybody who walks through the door as disabled. So like even if you're like sick or you don't know what's wrong with you and you walk in there, you're gonna experience ableism in some sort of way because it's built that way. So it impacts like all of us, and healthcare professionals need to understand that not everyone will have the language or even the know-how to challenge that when it's coming up against patients. Another question came in from Jessica Marie, who says, have you had examples of positive race sensitive interactions in your medical training? And how can we as medical professionals emulate that more?
Positive
race sensitive interactions. I don't know what that.
Yeah. I think for me, a lot of the learning that I've done has come from a lot of Indigenous physicians. And I took the cultural safety training because I might know how to interact with people from Six Nations, because I was raised in Six Nations. But I might not know how to interact with Anishinaabe or Cree or Ojibwe or all these different Indigenous nations, because I don't know their customs. And I view it the same way as interacting with other nations in terms of interacting with Black folks, white folks, Asian folks, because I think a lot of people group us all together, and if they have an encounter with one Native person, they'll think that we all operate that way. And so for me, a lot of the positive experiences have been like learning, because I'm still a medical student, learning from senior staff how to approach, I guess, different conversations or interactions where I thought I was being safe for a patient, but there's like different ways to say things. So I'm thinking of a patient that was I had a patient who was white appearing, and so I didn't. I think for me, when I come across a patient who is Indigenous, then I'm automatically like a certain like barrier gets dropped, and I just like have a more, I think, open conversation with them, or friendly. And I don't know if I mean to do that. It's just like, oh, hey, like, it's so cool. Like, yeah. So I had a patient who appeared white, and I didn't know it at the time, but the preceptor asked me to see the patient because they knew that the patient was actually Indigenous, but they were from a different nation. And so to me, the encounter went pretty good. But the assumptions that I made because the patient was white appearing, um, and I didn't ask any of the questions that I think I would have if I had known that they were Indigenous, because I would ask more around, I guess, different exposures that we have as Indigenous people. Because if you think of Indigenous people who live on reserve, and particularly in different reserves, we have environmental exposures to a lot of toxins that are released in our lands. We have, like, where I'm from, like, we don't have clean drinking water, so I have to drink from a bottle, and just things like that, where the preceptor told me to always be conscientious that you should try and treat patients the same, regardless of what race they are. And I think it was interesting, or what race you perceive them to be, because to me, I just it just didn't it just didn't cross my mind. So to me, it's funny how that works sometimes, because I also, when I give talks, I tell people, if I'm working at a, say, rapid assessment clinic in the emergency department, and so a patient comes with a cold, sometimes it's not relevant what race they are, right? And then if they have a community acquired pneumonia, or they have a ear infection, it doesn't matter what race they are, because they might be just coming for that treatment. And so I think it's nice if you treat every patient the same. However, you also have to be aware that you won't. You have implicit bias, and it's uncomfortable for people to confront that, but everyone has it. Every single person in this society has implicit bias. Once you get comfortable with that, you can start challenging that within yourself. And it takes you to do that work. You can't do it or expect somebody else to do it for you. When you see a patient and you have an automatic voice in your head that makes an assumption, you have to counter that yourself. And so it's the education that you have to do. And I appreciate all the Indigenous physicians, because I try to do all my electives with Indigenous physicians that teach me different ways to interact with different types of patients, so that my implicit bias, that I could challenge it more. So, like, I've worked with patients who identify as trans, or patients who use drugs, patients who use drugs while pregnant, like, learning how to care for certain patients, that I think I definitely have had implicit bias about, and then learning how to counter those narratives and make sure that they get the best care possible, has been what I continue to try to do. And I think that as a healthcare professional, we have to do that. And it is a lot of work on top of all the medicine that we have to know. But I think if we're called to do this work, it's something that we know that we have to do, and make room for, because I think we also have to make space for that kind of education.
Laura Moore also asked the question. She actually asked it twice, and I didn't see it, so I apologize, Laura. But she asked, "Did you encounter barriers throughout your application to medical school?"
So I had the privilege of getting to know the Indigenous Students Health Science Office when I was in high school, and had their support throughout my application. Um, and so to me, it was relying a lot on them to try and figure out the nuances of the application, because there's a lot to applications to medical school, and then to residency. You have to enter in every single detail of your CV. I couldn't afford an MCAT course, so I didn't take one, which means that I automatically could only apply to McMaster NASM or Calgary, and I didn't want to be too far away from my family, so I didn't go to I didn't apply to Calgary, so I only applied to NASM and MAC. And so I went into the MCAT just knowing that I could only take the one portion, the verbal reasoning, because I wouldn't know any of the science because I'm not a science. I didn't have science background, and I didn't have the courses that like pretty much guarantee that you do really good. And I didn't have time during my master's and running the summer program to dedicate the time to study so that I could apply to other schools. So I think to me that the MCATs, the NCAP prep courses are a couple thousand, and that's definitely a barrier for low income folk who can't afford that. Yeah, so, and it's unfortunate that one of the free resources online was recently bought out, so it'll eliminate a lot more low-income folks from applying to schools that require all pieces of the MCAT, especially if they have other things in life and they can't dedicate a lot of time to studying. And then to me, I had to apply twice. I didn't get in the first time, and then I had to apply again. And so I think in medicine, we also don't talk about that. And a lot of people are uncomfortable with sharing that, but to me, it's just part of my path, and I just wasn't as competitive as a candidate before, and then I did a master's, and then I got in. So to me, I think I answered the question. I don't know if I know there was like uncomfortable things that I encountered in the interviews. I remember like particularly in NASM, which threw me off because it's NASM, that somebody like said something about me being Native, and like I grew up on a reserve where people would tease you if you were a little bit like lighter than other people, and so for me, it always throws me when people identify as me as Indigenous or othered, because I'm like, I grew up with this. So to me, being in an interview and somebody automatically like assuming that I'm Native, and then making comments on that, is unfortunately probably things that people have to encounter. And the interview process, especially if you go through MMI multi-mini interviews, it's very subjective. People rank you in comparison to other, and if people have that implicit bias, they might that might interfere with the numbers, right?
Thank you. We also have a question from Julie Dring, and she says, do you have any recommendations for how people outside of the medical field, so perhaps professionals or leaders within other fields, can help bring awareness to these issues?
I think a lot of folks, it's a lot of educating and listening to Black, Indigenous, and people of color leaders who are voicing a lot of these concerns already, and they have been for years. And so it's changing the books that you read to be all the narrative of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and not just white authors talking about race relations. If I were to say a book written by a white person that you should read would probably be Unsettling the Settler Within, because it's about being a settler and unsettling the realities of that. But yeah, to me, it's a lot about educating yourself, and there are amazing people out there. It's just maybe they're not in your network, and evaluating that. If you're not following these people on social media, or if you're not actually looking to seek out alternative voices, then they might not be in your circle. And so it's a reflection process that you have to do to self-reflect. Whose voices am I paying attention to, and why is that, and how can I change it? And so like amazing people to follow would be like Sarah, because she posts all the time, right? Like you post all the time. Kojo, like there's so many people that you can start following, start learning from. who do this work, paid or unpaid, and are, I think, really great leaders in how to approach these issues and get involved, and not relying on the people in your life to do the educating, because sometimes it's just exhausting and sometimes people don't want to do that work. And maybe if you're in a relationship with them and you're just friends, they just want to be your friend and they don't want to be constantly educating you. So it's up to you to try and find resources. And if you don't know, there's no harm in messaging somebody who you do follow or somebody else and saying like, hey, can you point me in the right direction? And when I tell people that, and even now when family members or friends ask me questions like this, or questions about like medical questions, well, I always tell them to go see their family doctor. But to me, I also always say like, and you can like pay for Timmy's or like give me Starbucks, because to me, I really believe that if you're asking of labor of somebody to educate you, that you need to pay for it.
Thank you for that answer. Somebody asked what NASM is, and then somebody else, I'll just combine these two.
Sorry.
Somebody else asked, do specific kinds of art in a clinic help make an Indigenous person more comfortable as a signal that everyone is safe in our clinic? And that comes from Margaret Walden. And Annette Sandy asked what NASM is.
Sorry, I realize in medicine we do a lot of acronyms. NASM is the Northern School of, the Northern Ontario School of Medicine. So its foundations were actually built upon having rural, Indigenous, and Francophone communities, and so a lot of people look to it as one of the schools that were founded, a medical school that was founded to train people specifically to work in rural Indigenous or Francophone communities. So people have the assumption that they might be better in certain areas. I would say in terms of art within offices, I personally would love if more people supported Indigenous artists. I have a lot of friends who are artists, and to me, it wouldn't hurt. I don't know if me going into an office, I don't know if I would feel more comfortable, or I would just say like, that's a cool piece of art. And I think of it in terms of, it could signal that you're more open, because I also think of places that started to put up the pride flag and saying that they're more welcoming. But if you wouldn't do it, if you don't already have like a pride flag up, letting your patients know that it's welcoming for all folks, then also don't just put up Indigenous art just to put up Indigenous art. But yeah, I also think that, especially on Instagram, there's a lot of Indigenous and Black and people of color artists that you can definitely support, especially right now. And especially as healthcare providers, we can definitely divert some of our funds to people who might be struggling even more now because of COVID. They might really appreciate having more art. So yes, support Indigenous, Black, and people of color artists because they need it. But I don't know if it would make me feel comfortable. I'm trying to think if it would, but I also have a different relationship with my family doctor, who it took me years to find a decent family doctor who listened and made my experiences feel valid and took into account all my past traumas when we're doing an encounter. So I think for me, I think that matters more. Being sensitive culturally, say if you're doing the sexual history, if you're doing PAPs on women, things like that, or folks who identify as women or have female genitalia, when you're doing exams on them, being conscious of maybe trauma histories, just ways like that, I think show more than art.
On that note as well, do you have friends that you want to name drop who do art real quick as we wrap up?
Yeah.
Because Margaret Walding is offering to buy coffee or lunch, but also just you might want to name drop some of your friends who actually sell art.
Yeah. So if you go to Instagram, I have a friend, it's they all use their Ongwehoe names. So Tyerasesstha. That's one of them. Another one is YakahahseraTye. And another one is KALUYAHAWI so Galu Yahawi, she actually recently did, I'm going to show it because I love it so much. I'm doing a research paper. And we hired her. See if I can focus it. Probably not. We hired her to create this piece for my research paper. So if you hire Indigenous artists to help create graphics for research papers, they create masterpieces. And yeah, so support folks when you can.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We really appreciate having you today, and for the thoughtful conversation. We're going to definitely put up links in the comment section later on, linking back to some of the research pieces that you referenced, and also like the Indigenous artists that you referenced as well. Do you want to give a final comment before we close off this live stream?
No, I would like to say Yaara Gallo. Thank you for having me. And thank you for sharing this space with me. And thanks for not difficult questions.
Thank you so much.